On December 30th, 1999, in the U.S. state of Texas, a young girl named Crystal was spending New Year's Eve at her friend Katie's house.
Before we dive into today's case, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below. Every like, comment, and subscription helps me continue creating these in-depth crime investigations and real-life mystery stories.
The two girls spent the evening joking and laughing until it was finally bedtime. They playfully argued over who would sleep on the top bunk and who would sleep on the bottom, because the bed was a bunk bed. Neither of them realized that this joy-filled night would soon turn into a living nightmare. After the two girls fell asleep, at exactly 3:10 a.m., a neighbor living next door to Katie's family was startled awake by violent knocking at his door. When he opened it, he was shocked to see 10-year-old Crystal standing there, suffering from a severe wound to her neck. It was clear that whatever had happened to her was horrific. The young girl began pleading with the neighbor for help as quickly as possible, but she was completely unable to speak. Without a moment's hesitation, the neighbor immediately called 911. Crystal remained unable to speak, placing her trembling hands over her neck in sheer panic as blood poured heavily from the wound. When she realized she couldn't talk, she gestured to the neighbor, asking for a piece of paper and a pen. She began to write, explaining that her friend needed urgent help and that an intruder had broken into the house and committed a terrible crime. The neighbor called the paramedics and police again, begging them to hurry. The mother receives the news. 2.5 hours later, at exactly 6 a.m., Crystal's mother received a call from the hospital informing her that her daughter had been attacked, had suffered a severe neck injury, and needed to be airlifted immediately to another state for treatment at a more advanced medical facility. Shocked by the news, the mother rushed to the hospital. There, doctors delivered the devastating blow. Crystal's trachea had been severed, and her vocal cords were completely cut. The mother recalled that when she saw her daughter for the first time, the sight was heartbreaking and her body was covered in medical tubes. Because of the damage to her vocal cords, Crystal could not tell her mother or the doctors what had happened, so she relied on paper and pen. The very first question she wrote was, "Is my friend Katie okay?" The mother already knew that Katie had passed away, but she could not bring herself to break this painful news to her daughter just yet. The investigation and crime scene. At the same time, investigator John arrived at the crime scene. Upon entering Katie's bedroom, he was stunned by the sight. The room was covered in blood, and Katie had already passed away. The police informed the investigator that there was a second 10-year-old girl who had been sleeping alongside Katie, that she was still alive at the hospital, and that she was the sole witness to the details of the crime. Investigator John went straight to the hospital and promised Crystal that he would hunt down the perpetrator until he was caught, seeking justice for her and her late friend. Determined to help, despite her young age and the difficulty of describing the criminal's features in writing, Crystal took the pen and paper and began writing down precise details about the attacker's appearance. Based on this description, a police sketch artist drew a composite sketch of the suspect. When a family friend saw the sketch, they recalled a man named Tommy who worked in used car sales, whose features perfectly matched the description. The police brought a real photo of Tommy, along with photos of other suspects, and showed them to Crystal. As her eyes moved quickly across the photos, she pointed without hesitation to Tommy's picture, the exact same man the family friend had suspected. Investigator John placed Tommy at the top of the suspect list, arresting the perpetrator. 3 days after the crime, specifically on January 2nd, the police managed to locate Tommy's residence. They raided the trailer where he lived and arrested him without any significant resistance. Strangely, Tommy did not fight the arrest. Instead, he expressed relief, saying he was glad to finally be caught. When police confronted him with the murder charge, he confessed to everything, immediately and without pressure. He even agreed to accompany investigators back to the crime scene to explain exactly what he had done. Tommy told investigators that he had snuck into the house and entered the girl's bedroom. He found Katie asleep on the bottom bunk. When he placed his hand over her mouth, she woke up and began screaming for her friend Crystal, telling her to call her mother. Tommy stabbed her immediately, without hesitation. He then turned to Crystal, who was asleep on the top bunk, and stabbed her in the neck as well, before fleeing the scene. Tommy's confessions did not stop there. When he was taken back to the police station, he voluntarily began confessing to other crimes he had committed over a span of 20 years against men, women, and children, including the murder of 2 young girls in 1991. Investigators realized then that they were not dealing with an ordinary criminal, but with a serial killer who had managed to evade justice for 22 years until he was brought down by a 10-year-old girl. Crystal's account of the events.
9 months after the crime, after Crystal had fully recovered and her vocal cords had returned to normal, she was finally able to tell her story in her own voice. She said she woke up that night to the sound of Katie screaming and noticed that the bedroom light was on, even though it had been turned off when they went to sleep. She saw a strange man standing by her friend's bed with disheveled hair, a thick black beard, and terrifying evil eyes. The man did not notice her at first because she didn't make a sound. Crystal watched the criminal holding a knife as he approached Katie, who began crying out for help and telling her to call her mother, before the attacker silenced her completely and she fell to the floor. The criminal then turned to Crystal, reached out, and stabbed her in the neck. It was at that exact moment that her vocal cords were completely damaged. Despite the agonizing pain, Crystal kept her composure and stayed perfectly still, closing her eyes and pretending to be dead so the criminal would leave the room and abandon her. Once she was certain he had left the house, she painfully climbed down from the top bunk and tried to comfort her friend, only to realize her complete inability to speak. When she realized that Katie had stopped making any sound, a sense of imminent danger drove her outside to look for help. Before leaving the house, she heard the sound of a car speeding away. She wasn't certain if it belonged to the attacker, but she decided to take the risk. She went out barefoot into the darkness, heading toward the nearest well-lit house, where she knocked on the door and wrote down the details of what happened for the homeowner, asking him to call the police immediately. The trial. 9 months after the crime, Crystal, now 11 years old, had to appear in court to testify. She was the sole witness and the crucial piece of evidence in the case, despite the perpetrator's own confession. The young girl dreaded the experience, especially after remembering the story of another victim who had been attacked by a defendant inside a courtroom while testifying. A few weeks before the trial, a television program featured Crystal's story and brought her together with a teenage victim who had gone through a similar experience, having testified as a child against her sister's killer. This girl encouraged Crystal to face her fears and go to court to achieve justice for her late friend. When the trial began, Crystal declared that she was completely ready. She refused an offer to enter the courtroom through a different door than the perpetrator, asserting that she was no longer afraid of him. She entered through the very same door, stood in the courtroom, and recounted the full details of the crime. When asked to identify the perpetrator, she pointed to him with absolute confidence, confirming that he was the person who had attacked her and her friend. Crystal broke down during her testimony because of the overwhelming emotion, and the judge granted her a short recess. She then gathered her strength and completed her full statement. A few hours after the trial concluded, the jury delivered its verdict, convicting Tommy and sentencing him to death. This brought down the curtain on the case of a serial killer who had terrorized Texas for 20 years. Conclusion: Crystal miraculously survived, grew up, and graduated, always carrying the memory of her late friend Katie with her. Whenever anyone asks her if she is still afraid of the killer, she answers confidently that she gives him no thought at all. All of her focus is placed on the memory of her friend, whose spirit helped her continue living her life.